All right. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank Dave Desimone from the Black Point Estate and Gardens. I always remember the gardens, but never the estate. Yeah. I'm not sure why
they
that
go
is.
hand in hand.
Yeah, they do. They do. One can't be without the other. Anyway, he's come to talk about something not terribly related to Black Point, but I think still of real interest. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him continue on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maureen, and it's always nice to come to Janesville. I think we've had this relationship with the library here, I guess 5, 6, maybe longer. It's pre-COVID, so it's 5, 6, 7 years now we've been coming. We have 3 speakers in our Speakers Bureau, myself, Michael Rayberg, and Chris Brooks. So we're just really fortunate to have such great partners in the libraries, not just in Walworth County, but Rock County and Jefferson, sort of the whole southeast Wisconsin part of the state. So as Maureen mentioned, I'm the director of a place called Black Point Estate and Gardens, which is a historic house operated by the Wisconsin Historical Society on Geneva Lake. And this is a bit of a departure from that story. One of the nice things about being around in a place for 10 or 11 or 12 years is every so often you get to do something you like that might not always be the organization's desire. You get a little bit of freedom, if you will. And this project, or this program I pitched was, a little bit about my background. I'm from Ohio, the very far eastern edge of Ohio. So I grew up in very active in a natural environment. I like to be outside, hike, but that's a deciduous forest type of ecosystem where I lived. So think older growth, tall trees. It's real showy in the spring. It's not as, it's all green during the summer, and then it's real showy again in the fall. I moved to Wisconsin in 2012, and there are prairies in Ohio, but they're on the western side of the state. And they're pretty much gone. It's all farmland over there for the most part once you get past Toledo, through Indiana and then over. So when I moved to Wisconsin, I started to see remnants of what would have been prairie landscapes in this part of the country, some really nice nature preserves, but I didn't quite get it. I thought they're pretty, but it's sort of like tall grass and it's not all that exciting. But I've spent the last 10 or 11 years becoming more and more acquainted with my natural environment. And I noticed the nice thing about prairies, it's change, but it's very subtle, especially over the growing season from the spring through early fall. Whereas once again, a deciduous forest, it's pretty dormant. April rolls around, bam, all this color, especially blooming trees, woody plants like rhododendrons, azaleas, it's like fireworks, magnolias, pear, crabapple. Well, a prairie is very subtle, but once that forest is in full bloom and then it turns to green, it's green from middle of May or June until they decide to get, like maples and oaks, do all the glory of fall color. Well, a prairie requires the viewer to pay attention. It's going to change gradually over 2 or 3 week periods, and it might not be as showy as a forest, but if you're really observant, you're going to have an amazing view of color and amazing view of change. So there is a preserve about a mile away from my house, and I had hiked it probably 30, 40, 50 times in the last decade. I thought it would be really interesting to commit to hiking this exact piece of land 3 to 5 times a month and document my experiences as well as how the prairie changes during the course of those 12 months through photography. So I call it a love letter. Oops. I have to advance it twice here, once on the clicker and once on my computer because we're working on 2 different sets here. Call it a love letter to the Wisconsin prairie because this experience really highlighted to me how special these ecosystems are. Because they provide such a wide range of plant species. They support a wide range of life, both aquatic life if there's water features, ponds, insects, pollinators, smaller scale mammals, a lot of birds, of course, bird migration coming through the area. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this particular parcel, this is Geneva Lake. GPS, I'll automatically put my home on there, but that's how the proximity of, that's where I live, and this is the 160-acre parcel that is the Linn Township Nature Preserve. So if you're familiar with this area at all, a lot of people are familiar with Geneva, Lake Geneva on one side of the lake and Fontana on the other. We're on the south side of the lake. This parcel again right here, there's a school here that a lot of people know who are from that area. The preserve is across the street from the school. It's this square here, about a 160-acre parcel. It's divided into two zones. 154 acres is designated as a nature preserve and 6 acres is designated as a park. Does anybody know the difference between a nature preserve and a park? Well, a park is designated with the emphasis on human use. So humans are primarily the most important part of a park design. There's going to be maybe pavilions, ball fields, benches. It's going to be us at the center of that design and planning. A nature preserve is we're going to focus on the natural environment. Humans are welcome, but we're not managing that particular property with humans first and foremost. And so, let's see here. I might have a bigger close-up. I guess that's the biggest close-up. So the parking area is right here, and the area that's about 6 acres, there's like a picnic pavilion and a little area maybe for like kids to play. I think there's even a small playground. The big area is really managed with nature as its primary focus. All right, let me advance here. So just real little bit of background. A lot of the information that's going to come from this presentation comes from Kathy Leith, who is the Linn Township Supervisor and Chair of this particular park. And she's been involved from the beginning, so it was nice to have somebody that had a long view. When I get into the background a little bit, this really starts in like the late 1990s as a preservation project. All right. So, a couple other things, a little bit just real quick about methodology. The plan was to walk, there's 2 trails. There's a short trail, about 1/3 of a mile, and then a 2 mile. My plan was to walk the large trail every month, 3 to 5 times. Take photographs as I walked. I've given this program a couple of times. People ask what kind of camera. I've just been using my iPhone. It's the camera that's always with me. The downside is I can't zoom in to like get a lot of photographs of animals and pollinators because I can't get close enough. So there's some longer views. Keep track of my reflections. If anybody, and I also wanted to hike solo. So that was sort of important for me. And if you ever do any hiking solo, it's kind of interesting how quickly the mind unclutters and you're able to have some really deep thoughts about what's going on personally and professionally and everything else. And not get Lyme disease. If you've ever walked through tall prairie grass, you know that Wisconsin, the tick when we want to talk about pandemics, we should be talking about the proliferation of the tick population in this state. It's every year the DNR says this is going to be the worst year, and they're right. And it goes on and on. I had several ticks on me during this hike, but luckily none of them actually made a bite. They were on my pants or on my shoes. I usually am pretty well covered with deep woods off. So some people like statistics. These are the quarters of the year, spring, or I guess January through March. So I almost hit my goal. I kind of did actually. If you look at the lowest months were September through October, or I'm sorry, July through September. So the blue is the hikes, and then the green is the number of photographs. No real rhyme or reason, but it turned out that I really love fall, and I took a lot more photographs. There was just maybe a little bit more going on. Also, I knew that I was running out of time, and with any project, you kind of think, well, I have plenty of time, and then boy, that phone was out, and the camera was clicking quite a bit. Is anybody familiar with the term nature deficit disorder? So it really was coined by an author named Richard Louv in around 2007, 2008. And Richard was writing a book called Last Child in the Woods. And it was really geared towards parents with the emphasis on there's an entire generation growing up that whatever outdoor activities they have are structured. So it's playground activities or soccer, everything, there's an adult involved. And they're outside often, but it's very structured. Whereas my generation, I think probably everybody in this room, we often had a lot of time outside without adult supervision. And there's a benefit to that because it fosters independence, it fosters creativity, group dynamics. And so Richard's his argument was, we not only need to get kids outside, but we need to get kids outside in unstructured play. And if we don't, McDonald's figured this out 35 years ago. Happy Meals. They want their consumers to start at a young age and develop an emotional bond. So you go to McDonald's as a little kid, you get a Happy Meal, you get a toy, it provides a good memory, there's maybe a ball pit or a playground. They want you to become a lifelong consumer and have an emotional connection. People tend to support, especially as we age, the things we had an affinity for as kids. You might have been an avid reader as a child, you get away from it and you come back to it. You may have been a cyclist or somebody who liked to bike ride, and then life happens and then you get back to it. Well, if children aren't spending time outside, when they become adults, they don't have an affinity for it, they're not going to get reconnected, and then they're not going to their kids are going to have a harder time. So where all this is going is, for me, I like to hike, I like to take photographs, and when I'm doing these things, my well-being improves, and so this is sort of like a Venn diagram, and this is my happy place. The more hikes I'm taking, the more photographs I'm recording, my well-being gets better, and generally I just feel a sense of calm when I take these hikes. My blood pressure relaxes. So, and I don't know if anybody has those experiences when they're out in nature. I know we have somebody with the Herb Society. You can do the same thing when you're gardening. You know, you just kind of feel these benefits of being in a plant-rich environment. So the way the program's going to work is we're going to go through the 12 months, starting in January. Every once in a while, there will be a pop-up on the screen in like a gold or a yellow. That's for you to read, and that's just like what my personal reflections were happening at the moment that I took that photograph. So it's just kind of allowing you to come on the journey with me. The narration I'm going to provide is going to be a little bit of the geological history of how this part of the country is formed, a little bit about the folks that were here going back to like the 30,000 years ago right through present day, and then a little bit about the specific history of this parcel. So, all right, we're about to take a lap around the calendar here. Since we only have an hour, we're going to start our history with what is referred to as the later Wisconsin glacial period. And I'm not a geological expert, but I have read a few books on it, so I could cover it at a real high level. There might be folks here that might even be able to do a better job. But this particular part of the world, about 30,000 years ago, is covered by the Laurentide ice sheet. It advances into Wisconsin from Canada. And it's about 25 to 30,000 years ago. And it's going to literally flow across what is now the Great Lakes, the northern part of the UP, down into this part of the state, and it sits here. It doesn't actually get much further than Richmond, Illinois. If you know where Richmond is, it literally kind of just stops there. And it's going to sit there for tens of thousands of years, and then it's going to ever slowly retreat. That ice sits there, like I said, for about 15,000 years. About 20,000 years ago, the climate starts to warm enough to allow it to slowly retreat. And we're talking about inches a year. The best way to examine this is go to a Walmart parking lot after a heavy winter where there's been those piles of snow, and then they're gray and they're full of gravel. That's kind of what a glacier would have been like, is all the till it picked up and the stone, everything that gets graded into it. And then we have these warm spring days, but those giant mounds of gray, crusty ice are still there, and they slowly recede. And then sometimes they're still here in April, and they slowly recede. That's kind of like how a glacier would have inched backwards up to the ice sheet. About 20,000 years ago, as I mentioned, they start to retreat. They're going to leave the dramatic landforms in this part of the state. In Walworth County, Rock County, Jefferson, if we think about the whole southeast part, what's going to be left are moraines, kettles, kettle lakes, tunnel channels, braided river channels, plains of till, which are going to be very, very fertile. And that's going to define now not only just this part of the country, but Illinois, northern Illinois, Indiana, western Ohio, parts of Minnesota, even down into the western part of the state where you get to where it's the driftless area, that the glaciers weren't there. So that's kind of another delineation. All right. So about 14,000 years ago, the climate's warmed enough for man to start to hunt in this area of the world. They're not going to be residents here, but they might be passing through. And they're going to be hunting mammoths and other large extinct mammals, as well as mammals that are still present in the global ecosystem, but might not be indigenous to this part of the world now. And those humans would be really passing through. The climate, it's still at 14,000 years ago, is not inviting enough to set up any type of residence within this part of the country, or in the world, really. All right. It's also, in Wisconsin, so cold still 14,000 years ago that trees aren't present. So there are no trees in this part of the world yet. And you think about, we all know like on mountains, when you get to a certain elevation, they call it the tree line, and then it's too cold for anything to grow above that. There might be like scrubby things, but nothing that we would consider like taller trees. And that's the entire state of Wisconsin at that point. This photograph was taken January 20th, and there was a ton of geese flying overhead, and I wasn't really paying attention, and then after a while I thought, boy, they're really late this year. And then I pulled out my phone and I looked at my compass, and they were going north. So they were actually going home. Whether you believe in global warming or not, the animals are on a cycle, and they know when it's warm enough to start to come home. There's a couple of other indicators that we'll talk about as we go through the program. So I thought that was very, very early. And of course, we've had an extremely mild winter this year. So I wouldn't have been surprised if they would have been similar flight patterns. All right. As the last glaciers slowly retreat, we talked about the small bands of hunters coming into the area, and then it starts to begin around 12,000 years ago, a long period of occupation of this part of Wisconsin by Native Americans. First time of human occupancy, the climate was harsh, very harsh. So they're coming in to hunt, and they eventually start to settle, and they're settling here, and it's roughly about 10 months of what we would consider winter. Really about maybe 8 months with like a month and a half of summer, and then a very short spring and a very short fall. So it's harsh, very harsh conditions. But as we know, folks that live along the polar ice caps and like Eskimos, Native Americans in that part of the world, you can do it. It just requires a very different type of lifestyle. All right. Paleo Indians were the first human inhabitants, and this, like I said, is about 11,000 to 8,000 years ago. If you know anything about iPhones, you need to have a little bit of heat on your finger to get that screen to work really. And literally I was having to blow on it was extremely cold, but it was worth it because the light, especially in the wintertime, the sun sits lower in the horizon, you get some really pretty images. So now we're back to our hunter-gatherers. It's referred to or known by archaeologists as sort of as the Archaic period. This is the fifth hike, and I did have a concern. Am I going to be bored hiking the same trail, 3 to 5 times a month? By the fifth hike, I was already starting to be aware of how much things were changing, that I was sort of excited to have an opportunity, whether it was a Saturday or a Sunday, or if I could leave work early enough and still have some light, to get back out there. So I was already sort of hooked to this experience. So now we're going to move ahead a little bit more into the more recent past. About 500 BC to 1250 AD, that's the period that we're going to refer to as the woodland period, also referred to as the period of mound builders. So if you know your your Native American history or your archaeology, Wisconsin was a state that had a large number of Native American mounds. Many of them are gone, unfortunately, due to farming practices, due to treasure seeking, and it used to be like a recreational pastime in the Victorian era to go and dig up Native American mounds and look for whatever would have been deposited. There's a real nice collection of mounds outside, well, I guess it's technically Whitewater, not too far away from the campus. Of course, there's, what's the big site with the man that goes, it's like part of him has been destroyed, he goes across the road. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's like if you were to see it overhead, it is a man, but unfortunately a roadway went across his legs and so it's gone. But they painted those. We'll get that at the end of the program. So there are still a number of mounds that you can go and visit, but many, many are gone. All right, so we're still moving into February. In a period of severe drought and climate warming occurs around 400 to 500 AD. And that does a couple of things to the landscape. Most notably, that it gets warm enough for oak savannas to start to really develop. And it also is the beginning of what we would consider prairie landscapes. So it's just starting to warm up enough that the ecosystem is changing. And this is over about a 200-year period. All right. Still no leaves on the trees as we get into March, but they're coming. But the birds are back. Many of the birds are back in early, well, this is later March. We're going to jump ahead to the 1600s. By the 1670s, the Potawatomi, and if you think, as we get into this part of the state, before westward migration, there were a number of tribes, Sauk, Fox, Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk. The Potawatomi are going to ultimately migrate to this area from, they're originally part of the Algonquin-speaking folks, which would have been like an upstate New York area. And they're a little less aggressive, a little less warlike, and so they're actually pushed out as those populations expand. They migrate across the lower part of the Great Lakes, not through Canada, but the lower part of the Great Lakes. They end up around the 1600s settling in what would become present-day Wisconsin. And they eventually get kind of pushed down to the southern part of Wisconsin, the northern part of Illinois, by some more aggressive tribes like Menominee, Sauk, Fox, and Ho-Chunk. Now, if you know your Native American history, the group of Potawatomi that are living around the Geneva Lake area at the time of westward migration and contact as the United States is pushing forward westward, they're led by a leader by the name of Bigfoot. And Bigfoot and his group are not really involved in the Native American conflicts that are taking place in this part of the country with the U.S. Army. But nevertheless, in around 1834, they're summoned to Fort Dearborn, which would be present-day Chicago. And really what happened is it's about 3 days of negotiating, strong-arm tactics, not very fair and honest effort by the U.S. government, but they convince a lot of the tribe leaders to sign treaties that are going to say, you're going to vacate your land in 2 years, and we're going to relocate you to what is Native American territory, present-day Kansas. And it's going to be wonderful. You're going to get fair trade for your land, and it's going to be great. Well, 2 years go by, and the U.S. Army shows up in what is present-day Fontana. And obviously, Bigfoot probably doesn't really understand even what he's been asked to sign. There's, when I travel, like I know like 30 words of Spanish, and I have a hard time picking out my meal at a restaurant. I definitely don't want to sign a legal document that's a real estate deal. So you think about the disadvantages, and so because they're sort of not really prepared, they're forcibly loaded onto wagons and then taken from their homeland to Kansas. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, written by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a botanist, decorated professor, and a member of the Potawatomi Nation. This book comes out in 2013, and this is a direct quote. "Our lands around Lake Michigan were wanted by settlers. So in long lines, surrounded by soldiers, we were marched at gunpoint along what became known as the Trail of Death. They took us to a new place, far from our lakes and forest. But someone wanted that land too, so the bedrolls were packed again. Thinner this time. In the span of a single generation, my ancestors were removed 3 times, Wisconsin to Kansas, points in between, and then to Oklahoma. I wonder if they look back for a last glimpse of the lakes, glimmering like a mirage. Did they touch the trees in remembrance as they became fewer and fewer until there was only grass?" And that's not specifically unique to Wisconsin, but that is the United States' history, mistreatment of the folks that were here before us. The Geneva Lake Level Association keeps track of how that lake freezes every year, and they won't start counting until the lake is completely frozen over for 3 days. And those records go back to the 1870s. Was only frozen over for 6 days last year. It's a 140-foot deep lake, so it's a little bit slow to freeze. How many days do you think that lake was frozen over this year? 0. So take what you want about weather changing and in global warming. It'll be interesting to see as these records go forward. And there's all sorts of ecological challenges with these types of changes. Like there's a concern that a lot of these lakes will continue to have larger and larger algae blooms. Part of it's farm fertilizer runoff and areas well outside of my expertise. But there's also economic impacts. Like a lot of these southern lakes are really popular for ice boating, ice fishing, snowmobiling, and that's not available. It'll be interesting to see in the next 10 to 15 years as things continue to play out. So around the 1600s, Europeans are already here, but they're not really interested in this part of Wisconsin. It's the French, and they're along the Great Lakes, and they're looking for a place to portage the shortest distance possible along water routes to get to the Mississippi River and then down to New Orleans. You think about Prairie du Sac, Prairie du Chien, Dubuque, St. Louis, New Orleans. Those are all French cities. But Lake Geneva, this part of the state where we're at, especially the Lake Geneva area, there's no river into that lake. There's a river out, but it goes the wrong way for navigation for French fur traders. It runs to the east. So it goes Geneva to White River to the Fox near Burlington. The Fox then bends back and then eventually connects with the Illinois. So if you're looking for the most direct route for navigational purposes, if you're a French fur trader, you're aware of this part of the state, but it's not really on your radar. So it does allow those Native Americans to be more or less undisturbed until about the 1820s. So around the 1820s, European American migration, if you will, is moving across Indiana, Illinois, and then into the Wisconsin territories. Those early Americans are fascinated with these open prairies because when you're settling in places like the Allegheny Mountains or the east side of Ohio or Kentucky and you want to farm, those areas are almost completely covered with trees. So you've got to first clear cut, then you've got to remove stumps, and then you have to maybe take a gamble at what the soil types are going to be. But you get to prairies and you might just have to burn the prairie And we talked earlier about that really, the way those glaciers left all this fresh till. This is extremely rich soil for crop cultivation. Very attractive, and that's why the Midwest is the breadbasket of not only the United States, but in many ways still the world. Anybody have a dog? I used to have dogs until like 5 years ago. When I had a dog, I didn't like this time of year because they brought all the mud into the house. Like I call March Mud Month. But now without having a dog, when I see those dog prints, it reminds me of how much fun it was to get out again with the dog. So I probably will have another dog at some point. So we talked a little bit about fire. It's always been a healthy partner with prairies. In dry conditions, in early spring, summer, and fall, lightning could strike and set a fire ablaze. We hear about these fires out west, thousands and thousands of acres. That would have been, imagine, a couple thousand acres of unbroken prairie land in Illinois or Wisconsin, and a lightning strike. You could have these large fires. Of course, the indigenous Americans and then later on early adapters to this part of the world used prairie to not only clear the land for crop propagation, but they could use it to hunt animals, to clear the land so they would have better view sight in case they were setting up their villages or homesteads, so you could kind of, when you think about it now, it's like a lot of people put a big area around their house and then they let the tall grass a little further out. So prairies today are still managed by burns. Have you ever seen a prairie burn taking place? It's the gentlemen and women in the kind of like the Tyvek suits with the little flamethrowers. It's pretty fascinating to watch. All right, so we're into April. And the first thing that I noticed, I was gone for about here we go. It had almost been a month. Work gets really busy for me in April. I ended up with a 10-day long, I was fortunate enough to take a 10-day vacation to the Netherlands on a bicycle trip, and so life got busy. And when I get back into hiking, I couldn't get over how much green had popped up in the 25 days or so between hikes. So that kind of covers that a little bit. Yeah, I notice everything is green. Historically, these prairies would have supported a lot of wildlife, including prairie wolves, raccoons, squirrels, fox. So we're not talking large mammals, we're talking mammals that are small enough to take advantage of the cover. Fox, rabbit, otters, mink, muskrat, deer, chicken, quail, snipe, woodcock, plover, sandhill cranes, geese, ducks, a number of birds, both that were here throughout the entire growing season as well as migratory birds, swans, and even loons. I did see a lot of wildlife on my hikes, but like I said, I wasn't really able to get great photographs of them, so I left them out. Otherwise, we'd be looking at little tiny dots on the screen, and I would try to remember if that was a fox or something else. The reason this popped into my head is there's a large housing development opposite the street of this preserve. And when I moved here, there's lots for probably 45, 50 houses. And when I first moved here, there were 2. And there weren't many built until about 2019. There were a couple more that popped up, and there weren't many built during 20 and 21. And now there's about 15 or 20. And so I noticed when I'm walking in that direction, I took no photographs because it's this beautiful prairie, but then there's these houses that are sort of like fingers in the pie, if you will. And has anybody traveled or driven out west and you get to like Montana, big sky country, and you see these long sweeping views that are breathtaking? Well, those would have been here as well. They would have been on the East Coast, but we've really fragmented our land for human purposes, for use, whether it's industrial, residential, growing purposes. But boy, there's something about a long view that I just find to be inspiring and uplifting. So I think they matter. As we get through April, We're going to turn the corner into May. I also realized I hike slow. And then it dawned on me, I'm 53 years old. I do everything slow these days. And I'm okay with that. I've earned it, right? Young people are in a hurry. I think as we age, we should all remind ourselves that we've earned the right to do whatever we want, as slow or as fast as we want. Big difference from those earlier images. They do mow the trail, but this particular spring, we had a really dry summer last year, but we had a wet spring. And that spring, it was like, I would hike and then 3 days later I'd go back and I almost couldn't spot the trail. This is when the ticks started to show up, by the way. The word prairie is a French term. I didn't know that, but it means meadow or grassland. Let's see. It's interesting that the prairies, about 2/3 of the plant is below ground in a prairie. It's only about 1/3 that's above. And we'll get to that in a little bit when we start to talk about the different types. The most rapid changes in prairies have occurred in the last 200 years. You could say the same thing about almost any ecosystem. Man, our growth on this planet has exploded over the last 200 years. It's having a huge impact on all ecosystems. But in prairies in particular, as those North American settlement moves across the country, European settlers are bringing the crops they want: corn, soybean, Kentucky bluegrass. That's going to replace the native grasses. Cattle replace bison and other grazing animals. And of course, then we all replaced the Potawatomi. This was right before a downpour. And then that was, if I recall, I took this photograph, it poured, and then we didn't have rain in Lake Geneva for about 8 weeks. Literally extremely, extremely dry summer. I talked about 2/3 of the growth underground. There's a reason for that. It's a survival tactic because prairies can be pretty harsh environments. That allows the plant to really get deep down into the soil for water and nutrients. Many of the plants have leaves that are finely divided, slender, which can be curled or rolled up to sort of protect them in periods of dry conditions. Many of them have fuzzy hairs or stems, sticky parts of the plant. Birds, have you ever walked through tall grass and you come home, or you walk out and there's all these things stuck to you? That's by design. Because these plants want to continue to propagate. Some of that happens through just wind blowing things. Think of a dandelion or swamp milkweed, when that pod blows and then all the little seeds blow. Other plants are going to benefit by having those sticky parts or those little burrs, those little things that are going to connect to animals as they go by, and that's how they're going to continue to propagate. So if you're going to go through a tall patch like this, you're coming home with some things. That's for certain. There are 5 variations of prairies: wet mesic, dry mesic, and dry, depending on the type of soil available and the moisture. There's really no sharp distinction between these types. This 154-acre preserve has all 5. And it's like a beautifully landscaped, or a painting that an artist has, or an orchestra where everything's working together. It's like one type just kind of dovetails into another. It's not like a hard edge where maybe a forest meets the prairie. It's very subtle, which comes back to, as we go through this year, the change is subtle. If you were to drive by this day in and day out at 35 miles an hour from May through probably September, it wouldn't look like it's changing much. But once you get inside it and you're walking it, you're right on top of it, you do notice those changes. And so although things are blooming, I just know from my own personal history, things are blooming even though there's a large drought, but the plants are shorter than what I've experienced in the past. There are certain parts of the trail where by this time of the year, it would be like walking through and the plants were wanting to sort of connect over the path, and now they're about shoulder length. So if you like talk to an arborist, it's usually like 1 year's drought isn't the end of the world for a tree, because the tree has the ability, if it's a healthy tree, to deal with it. It's usually if you have 2 or 3 years of drought, because they're really tapping into those reserves, and then eventually you start to see. So it'll be interesting. If we have another dry summer, the plants will be a little bit less tall, but they'll still probably have enough energy to do their thing. But maybe after 3 or 4 years, will it be just enough that the plants that are there will start to change? Years ago, oh gosh, 15 years ago now, I worked at an arboretum. We had over 3,200 acres of gardens and natural areas. We had a volunteer by the name of Ted Yoakum. Now, Ted was in his late 80s and early 90s when I crossed paths with him, and he would still lead rugged hikes. So he was a tour guide, a hike guide. And a couple of things about Ted. I always thought he was a naturalist because he wore like a Boy Scout uniform and a big hat and a bolo tie. Turned out he was a retired accountant that just liked to lead these hikes as he got a little bit older. But he was a throwback. He was born in the 1920s. There's not many people left. I don't think anybody left from the 20s. But at that point, he was already a super senior. He had outlived almost all of his peers. And he shared a lot of wisdom. And we were talking one day. I grew up in a city, and he grew up in a rural environment and then moved to a city. And he said something with me that stuck with me, but I didn't really quite get it until this project. And Ted told me a person should familiarize themselves with a piece of land over all 4 seasons at least once in their life. And as I'm getting into July, I'm starting to understand why. Because it's a very humbling and grounding experience when we tend to put all of the focus on us as we go through life. Where humans are very human-centric. And then when you start to see the changes, like this prairie does not care if I'm there or not, and the world will not care if we're here as a species or not. It will literally, the last day there's a human on this planet, everything else will just keep going. It's very humbling to see those changes and how we're really connected and interconnected to everything. Over the eons of time, prairie plants have survived significant climate change. Like I said, they emerged about 400 AD, so it's been 1,800 years. They've experienced drought, fire. This is something that's a very adaptable landscape, well suited to change and harsh conditions. And I know we talked about that earlier. Does anybody else feel that? Like when you go out on a hike or just outside or in your garden, you kind of get a sense of calm? Now the bloom cycle is early April through November. What's nice about prairies, the way it blooms subtly, is the plants will bloom and then they die back 2 or 3 weeks later and another group of plants will bloom. For pollinators, we tend to end up with monocultures, which have food available for pollinators, but it's highly concentrated sometimes, like it'll all bloom at once. And then so it's a feast or famine for a lot of our insect friends. Whereas prairie plants, because of this rolling bloom, the bees and the hummingbirds and the butterflies, they have food all summer long. It's just different type of food. If you drive through any part of Wisconsin, you see cornfields, right? Like that's a monoculture. It sure looks green and lush when the corn's high. And then there's nothing from November through, so it can't support any other life. If the only crop that we had available to us was corn, when would we eat? We would eat in the fall, and then we'd figure out a way to store it and eat it, but isn't it nice to have all that variety? That's what a prairie plant cycle does for the insects and the pollinators and the mammals that are there. What you're going to find in prairie landscapes, Indian grass, purple prairie clover, spiderwort, golden Alexander, common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, Indian plantain, compass plantain, prairie dock, Indian hemp, Joe Pye weed, daisy, false sunflower, coneflower, black and brown-eyed Susans, bergamot, giant ragweed, coarse goldenrod, aster, bur oak, walnut, various small woody plants, including everybody's favorite, buckthorn, which isn't supposed to be there, but buckthorn just shows up everywhere. Like I said, it was a really dry summer. Was it dry here last year as well? I would imagine it's pretty similar. I mean, we're 50 miles apart. August. So we're into August. Things are starting to show signs of the coming fall. Color is changing, starting to see a little richer golds and browns. We roll into September. Set the alarm at 5 because everybody kept talking about the blue light. There's the golden period, golden hours at the end of the day and the blue hours in the morning for photographers. And I've been taking a lot of photographs midday and towards the end of the day after work, so I thought, let's start. I'm going to spend the fall getting up early. I did it once. That was it. So this is the only photograph of a sunrise that we're going to have. But I also like the light that comes with the end of the day, opposed to the sort of more blue light in the morning. I'm usually 6:30 in the morning, kind of wake up, 5 a.m. Into September again, things are kind of moving along nicely. Just real quick, a little bit about path design. I don't know why this popped into my head, but there's benches along the trail, and it's great because you're walking, it's hot, you might want to take a break. But I'm also noticing the bench placement. So it's right on the trail's edge, and then there's all this area behind it, right? So I thought, what if we decided, rather than have a bench along the trail, because the trail is a transportation corridor. And when you're seated along a transportation corridor, you're always reminded that you should probably get back to moving because it's like you can't escape. It's like sitting alongside the road. There's the road still. It's like this is what, you're on some kind of journey. But if you're in a living room or a place that you're sort of where you're off the trail, you're kind of giving yourself permission to maybe spend more time in it. So I'm advocating for benches to be placed in what I'm going to call plant living rooms. So trail designers could take a trail, cut into this, and then create a circle or a square, maybe 10 by 10, so that you're off the trail and you're completely surrounded by plants. And the trail's still right there, but it's like you're literally, when you're seated there, other hikers are coming by, and I'm just thinking like, I'm always reminded that I still have to finish this hike, where maybe it would give me a little bit more permission to spend some time in a plant-rich environment without worrying about, like, do I need to get moving? Other countries, especially in Asia, it's probably like 15, 20 years, I've heard about this called forest bathing. Has anybody heard about that? Where it's, for our culture, because we tend to be on the go, 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 we measure our experiences often by the number of miles we hiked, or I've only got 2 hours, I could get in a quick hike. Whereas like the idea of forest bathing is, it's not how far you go. It's you might walk 50 feet into a forest from the parking lot, and then grab your little chair or your bench or sit on a log and then just stay there for an hour. And you can get many of the benefits that you can get if you power through a 7-mile hike at, getting your heart rate up in that. So just something to think about. If anybody here has the ability to influence park departments, I'm going to copyright what I call it, plant living rooms. So into October. I really like photographing October fall scenes on rainy days because you get the color variations. When everything's bright, it's great. But these yellows and oranges and reds really just start to pop when the rest of the background's a little bit more muted. And imagine, compare this image to what these photographs look like in, January and May. They change quite a bit, but it's the same 154 acres. I think I had a swamp milkweed earlier in this presentation as well. This is almost the same photograph. That one where I took this photograph right before it rained, and it would kind of have like a bluish tint in the sky. This is almost the same vantage point. Then we're into November. Just want to check my notes here. So, a little bit about the park itself. So in 1998, this land was slated for development. It was to be a golf course and housing development for about 50 homes. Local resident by the name of Melita Gruno, who was an avid horseback rider and had spent a lot of time, most of her life, in Linn Township, decided she didn't want to see that happen. So she purchased the land, and that was in 1998. She worked with the Geneva Lake Conservancy to get it protected under easements, and then donated it with the Conservancy. So they donated it to Linn Township. So the township now owns the land, but the Conservancy holds the easement, so it's protected in perpetuity. The township starts to manage this, like I said, as a nature preserve with a very small parcel as a park in 2000. 2008, they're recognized by the United States EPA for their work on a very well done restoration of a Wisconsin prairie and habitat for birds. So within 8 years, it went from, I don't have images of what it may have looked like back then, I'm sure they exist, and it continues. They do manage this very actively with a prairie restoration group called Tall Grass Prairie out of Milton. They spend about $40,000 a year, so it's not a huge draw down on the tax base, right? That's in the city government, $40,000 is like a line item. It's pretty small. So I think it's great reward for the amount of investment that they put into it. And most of the funds are used to remove those invasive plants that keep coming in, prescribe burns, and there is some interpretive signage that talks about what we're seeing on the trail. Volunteers conduct multiple bird counts. Is anybody familiar with the Audubon Society's IBA designation, important bird area? So if you understand migration, so there's birds that live, say, like in Canada, and they migrate into Alabama. And wherever they live in Canada is perfectly fine, and wherever they migrate to in Alabama is perfectly fine, but they're going to have to make a journey, right? And like if I were to drive to San Francisco, I'm going to need a couple of places along that route to spend the night. Probably every so many hours, I'm going to want to get out and use the bathroom. I'm going to want to rehydrate, maybe get some food. My gas needs to be refilled. So as these birds make these migrations, they need these areas along the route to land and rest for a day or two to refuel. And so each one of these is like a link in that chain. And so what happens is when we talk about habitat loss and degradation, this might be fine in Canada and this might be fine in Alabama, but let's imagine, we're going across the country and we take away 20 quick trips. And you got to start to drive a little bit further and you miss one of them. And then your car breaks down because you're out of fuel, it just stops. And now you have to walk 15 miles to the nearest gas station and you're 87 years old. Chances are you're not going to make it. So what happens is as the gaps get larger and the areas get smaller, they can support even less of that migration. And then the chain gets broken, and so maybe the younger of that species can continue to go a little bit further, but the older of that species don't make it. And so little by little, the actual populations of those individual species can get reduced. This particular parcel is not a designated important bird area, but you think about it, you're coming across Lake Michigan, and you're maybe going along the Mississippi River, and you look at Wisconsin with its 14,000 lakes. So we've got plenty of water for the birds to come and land. But it's nice to also have these nature preserves near these bodies of water because humans are also attracted to water. almost all the lakes in this part of the state have houses all around them. And that's, Geneva Lake has houses all around them. We're this preserve, Kishwaukee, which is a preserve in Williams Bay, is close to the lake. So the water's there, but there's also the habitat and some of the food things that these migratory birds need. The land doesn't have a true oak savanna, but there are some nice trees. Oh. If you do any winter hiking, you know what I'm talking about when you get these crisp days. But there are some nice older trees. I love photographing trees when the leaves are on, also when the leaves are off. It just shows the structure. And we're just about out of time, so I've got a couple more. I don't know why, I was feeling really pensive in December. I wasn't in a bad mood or a sad mood, but I was thinking about we're all on our own individual trails. And life gets busy, and we're all filling these pages of our lives. But to be really honest, most people aren't going to know us. If you have children, they're going to know you. And if you have grandchildren, they're going to know you. But not good, bad, or otherwise, but most of us will be forgotten within about 50 years of our death. Maybe 60, 70 years if we're lucky, and then we're going to be gone. So as I was hiking through this, it wasn't really a sad thought. It was, boy, I probably should do a better job of reconnecting and spending the time with the people that I'm here with now, instead of maybe always being busy with my life, like work and school and kids and everything else. We kind of get busy, and then all of a sudden we wake up one day and we're in our 80s and go, boy, that was a quick run. And now I have some time, but we need to take time to connect with the people that are near and dear to us. December 23rd, I was heading back to Ohio to visit family. I was really hoping for a snowstorm. It never happened in December. I got up at 6:30 in the morning, 10-hour drive, and it was foggy as all get out. And I got about 2 miles past the prairie, and I said, you know what, I know you want to drive. You got a long day ahead of you, but the fog is pretty cool. I won't be back until the 31st. Let's do this hike. And it was awesome because this was, if you ever hike in the fog, it's sort of fun and atmospheric and spooky all at the same time. And so it did provide images that looked drastically different than anything else I had seen. And I did take a couple of photographs facing that housing development because it disappeared. That's the direction of the housing development. Normally, you're going to see these little sort of like crooked teeth jarring up in the horizon, the peaks of the houses. I thought that was really appropriate. We started to get some wind as the fog was lifting, and I'm watching all the prairie grass, and I think there's sort of like a cleansing of that when wind comes through a prairie. It's rejuvenation, but it's also cleansing. I believe this is the last photo. So real quick on this, I've got my notes here. So the last hike, at least the last hike in this project, I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, provided me with a reason and a routine. These hikes, which I all did solo, provided me with plenty of time to reflect, to unclutter my mind, in many ways to meditate and become more in tune with my natural surroundings. To have a better sense of place, of what it means to be here, even if I'm not from here. Hopefully the presentation was both informative and entertaining for you. Life is short. It's not meant to be spent indoors, if one could help it. And then according to the Environmental Protection Agency, the average American spends 93% of their life in a manufactured indoor environment. I don't care if it's Notre Dame, the Taj Mahal, the most beautiful home that's ever been built, it cannot offer the beauty that is a plant-rich, naturalistic environment. Postscript, January 1st, 2024. Yes, I did take a hike on January 1st. And I've continued to hike this trail, not necessarily 5 times a month, but more. I thought I'd be done with it. Like, okay, let's go find somewhere else to hike. And it's coming back to like visiting an old friend every time I do. And so it'll be interesting to see as I go through the season if I continue that. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.